The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Maren Solis would later think was fitting. Tuesdays being the kind of day that seemed designed for things going quietly, irreversibly wrong. She read it standing at the kitchen window of her sister's house in Hamilton, Ontario, where she'd been sleeping on a narrow cot behind the pantry for 11 weeks. The letter was from a solicitor in a town called Cold Hollow, Alberta. It informed her, in the careful language of men paid to deliver bad news politely, that her arrangement with Mr. Douglas Aldrich Fenn, the man she'd corresponded with for 4 months, the man whose photograph she'd studied until she'd memorized the set of his jaw, had been terminated. Not cancelled. Terminated. The distinction mattered, because it meant the fee she'd paid a matchmaking agency in Toronto to arrange the introduction was gone. It meant the train ticket she'd purchased, second class, Hamilton to Edmonton, was now a one-way journey to nowhere in particular. And it meant that Maren, 28 years old, a widow of 14 months, with $43 and a trunk that held everything she hadn't sold to pay for her husband's funeral, was standing in her sister's kitchen reading words like unforeseen circumstances and deeply regrets, while the smell of burned porridge drifted in from the next room. She folded the letter, set it on the windowsill, watched a sparrow land on the fence post, and then immediately leave, as if even the bird couldn't commit to staying. Her sister Harriet appeared in the doorway, wiping flour from her hands. One look at Maren's face told her everything. "How bad?" Harriet asked. "He found someone else." Maren picked up the letter again, turned it over as though the reverse side might offer something more useful. Or his mother found someone else for him. The solicitor wasn't specific. Harriet made a sound that was half sympathy, half something more pragmatic. She had 4 children and a husband who worked long hours at the mill. Her kindness was real, but it had limits shaped by necessity. "You could stay," Harriet said. "Angus wouldn't. I know he wouldn't say anything." Maren tucked the letter into her apron pocket. "That's not the same as it being all right." She spent 3 days considering her options, which took 3 days only because she needed time to accept that she didn't have many. She could find work in Hamilton, a millinery, maybe, or a boarding house, but she'd done that for 8 months after Bernard died, and it had barely covered food, let alone anything saved against the future. She could write to the agency and demand a refund she wasn't entitled to. She could write to Mr. Fenn himself, though she couldn't imagine what she'd say. On the 4th day, she went to the agency on King Street and sat across from a woman named Mrs. Pelletier who wore a jet brooch and the expression of someone accustomed to delivering disappointment. "There is one other situation," Mrs. Pelletier said, after they'd established that no, the fee was not refundable, and yes, the agency did have a duty of care to place clients appropriately. She opened a folder that looked considerably thinner than the others on her desk. "It's in Alberta, the Northwest Territories border. A rancher, widower, with 2 children. He's been on our books for some time." "How long?" Mrs. Pelletier paused in a way that answered the question. "1.5 years, she finally said. "He's particular about terms." Maren looked at the folder. "What does he want?" "Someone competent. He said, and I'm quoting directly, that he doesn't need romance. He needs someone who can run a household and won't be frightened off by the winters." Mrs. Pelletier glanced up. "He has an 8-year-old daughter and a boy of 11. His wife died 3 years ago. What happened to her fever?" Maren thought about $43 and the cot behind the pantry, and the way Harriet's husband Angus went quiet at the dinner table whenever she sat down to eat. Not unkind, just quietly conscious of an extra mouth. "What are his terms?" she asked. The man's name was Alistair Greer. His ranch was called Broken Willow, which Maren found either poetic or ominous and couldn't decide which. He wanted a trial period of 3 months before any formal arrangement. He would provide room, board, and a wage of $8 a month regardless of outcome. If both parties agreed at the end of 3 months, the arrangement would become permanent. He'd written his own note at the bottom of the agency's standard form, in a hand that pressed hard into the paper. "I am not an easy man. The work is real and the country is hard. I am telling you this plainly so you don't arrive expecting something different." Maren read it twice. Then she wrote back and said she'd take the train Thursday. She arrived in Cold Hollow on a Friday afternoon in early October, when the sky had that particular prairie quality of being enormous and completely indifferent to the humans moving beneath it. The station was a single building with a pot-belly stove and a station master, who pointed her toward the hitching post without looking up from his newspaper. Alistair Greer was already there. She recognized him from the photograph, tall, broad through the shoulders in a way that came from work rather than size. Dark hair threaded with gray at the temples, though he couldn't be more than 38. He stood with his arms at his sides and watched her cross the platform with an expression that gave nothing away. "Mrs. Solis," he said. Not a question. Mr. Greer, he took her trunk without asking, lifted it into the back of the wagon like it weighed nothing. Then he helped her up onto the seat and climbed up himself, and they were moving before she'd had time to be nervous. They rode in silence for 10 minutes. The town thinned out behind them and the land opened up, flat and rolling and impossibly wide, the grass already going brown, a line of trees to the north that marked a creek bed. "My daughter's name is Petra," he said finally, eyes on the road. "She's 8. She'll talk to you. My son is Conal, 11. He probably won't. I have younger siblings," Maren said. "I know how to wait." He glanced at her sideways. Something shifted in his face, but she couldn't read what. "You know what you're coming to?" he asked. "You told me in your letter. I told you it was hard. I've had hard." Another silence. Then he said, "The woman before you lasted 6 weeks. The one before her, 3 months. Neither of them left because I was unkind. They left because the winters here are." He stopped. "There aren't words that prepare you." "Tell me anyway," Maren said. He did. He talked for the rest of the drive without looking at her, describing the ranch with the same directness he'd used in his letter. The cattle count, the hay stores, the problems with the south fence, the way the creek froze in December and they'd have to haul water, the fireplace in the kitchen that drew well and the one in the parlor that didn't. By the time Broken Willow came into view, a long, low house with a covered porch, a barn, outbuildings fanned out behind. Maren felt she knew the place better than she knew most people she'd lived beside for years. What she hadn't expected was the color of it in the late afternoon light. The house was built of weathered timber that had gone silver gray, but someone had planted a row of poplars along the south side, and they'd gone entirely gold. It was the most beautiful and lonesome thing she'd seen in months. Petra was waiting on the porch. She was small for 8, with her father's dark hair and a watchful quality that Maren recognized immediately. The particular stillness of a child who'd learned to assess adults before trusting them. "This is Mrs. Solis," Alistair said, handing the reins to the boy who'd appeared from the barn. "She'll be staying a while." Petra looked at Maren with the frank appraisal of someone who didn't yet know she was supposed to hide it. "The last one," cried the first night, she said. "Petra." Alistair's voice was quiet but final. "I might cry too," Maren said. "It's been a long journey." Petra considered this. "I'll show you your room," she said, and led the way inside with the authority of a child who'd been keeping house longer than she should have had to. The room was small and cold, with a window that faced east and a quilt that had been mended so many times it was more patches than original fabric. But it had a door that closed and a hook on the wall for her coat, and when Maren sat on the edge of the bed after Petra left, she felt something she hadn't felt in Harriet's house. Private. She felt private, like something that belonged to her. She unpacked her trunk methodically, found the kitchen by following the smell of something burning and arriving in time to rescue a pot of stew that Petra had apparently set on at an optimistic temperature and then forgotten. "You cook?" Petra asked, appearing in the doorway. "I do. Papa just makes it thick so it doesn't matter if it burns. Does it work?" "Not really." Petra settled herself at the kitchen table with the practiced ease of someone who spent most of her time there. "Conal won't eat it, but he doesn't say anything." Maren stirred the stew, added water, assessed. "Salvageable." "Where is Conal?" she asked. "Barn, avoiding the new arrival." Petra looked impressed that Maren had named it directly. "He doesn't like change," she said. "After Mama died, he didn't talk for almost a month." Maren let the silence sit for a moment before she said, "I lost someone too a year ago. My husband." "Did you stop talking?" "I kept talking. I just stopped saying anything real." She tasted the stew, reached for the salt. "Sometimes that's worse." Petra watched her with those careful dark eyes. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "The last one kept asking Papa if we had a piano." Supper was the 4 of them at the long table, Alistair at the head, Petra beside Maren, Conal at the far end with the deliberate positioning of a boy who'd staked out his neutrality. He was taller than she'd expected, with his father's jaw and his mother's coloring, the reddish tint to his brown hair visible in the lamplight. He ate everything on his plate without speaking. Alistair ate and read the week's newspaper simultaneously, which in another man might have seemed rude, but in him felt simply like efficiency. "The stew's better," Petra said. "Same stew," Alistair said without looking up. "Different cook." He turned the page. That night Maren lay in the cold room and listened to the sounds of the house, the wind, the creak of the floor. When Alistair got up once in the night, she heard him cross the main room, heard the back door, heard him return 20 minutes later, checking on something. Checking on all of it, probably, the way people did who felt responsible for everything and couldn't stop. She understood that. She'd felt it too after Bernard. The compulsion to check every lock, every window, every place where things could go wrong. She fell asleep before she'd finished the thought. The first week was about learning the shape of things, where Alistair kept the tools, which horse was patient and which was not, How cold the mornings were by the angle of frost on the window glass. Petra's preference for company in the kitchen. Connell's preference for being alone in the barn and pretending it was about the horses. She didn't try to charm them. She didn't try to be liked. She just did the work and paid attention. And somewhere in the second week she realized that Connell had started timing his barn chores to end near breakfast rather than after. "He's coming around," Petra said one morning, with the authority of an older sibling who'd been observing the situation from the beginning. "Maybe he just likes eating," Maren said. Petra grinned. "He does. We all do. Papa said you're a better cook than he expected." "Did he say it to you or to me?" "To me. He doesn't say things to people directly if he can help it," Maren had noticed. Alistair communicated primarily through action and the occasional indirect statement that required interpretation. He'd put a new bolt on her bedroom door without mentioning it. He'd left a pair of heavier work gloves on the kitchen table beside her coffee cup one morning, 2 sizes smaller than his own. He'd asked her, once, with the air of someone trying to make a question sound administrative, whether she'd been warm enough. She'd said she had been. He'd nodded and gone back to his ledger. The first time they had anything like a real conversation was in late October. A Saturday evening when the children were asleep and a storm had made it impractical to do anything except sit near the fire. Maren was mending. Alistair was reading, or trying to. She noticed he'd turned the same page 3 times. "You don't have to sit there if you'd rather be somewhere else," she said. He looked up. "What? You keep turning the same page. If you want to be alone, you can say so. I'll take this to the kitchen." A beat of silence, then, "I'm not good at sitting with people," he said. "It's not? I don't mean it as a slight. I know." She tied off a knot. "My husband was the same way. He'd go quiet for days and then feel guilty about it. Did that bother you?" She considered the question honestly. "Sometimes. Mostly I learned to read it. Quiet isn't always the same as unhappy." She cut the thread. "He was a good man. He just carried things privately." Alistair was quiet for a moment. "How did he die?" "Heart. He was 34. She smoothed the mended seam. "Sudden. I'm sorry. So am I." She picked up the next item needing mending, Connell's work shirt, a tear across the shoulder. "How did your wife die?" "Fever. She was sick 3 weeks. Petra was 5. He set the book down. "She used to say this place would be something once we got it right." She meant it seriously. She kept a list of improvements. "What was on it?" He almost smiled. The corners of his mouth moved in that direction and then stopped. "A new porch. Glass in the south window. It had board over it that first year. A kitchen garden with a proper fence so the deer couldn't get to it. Did you do them? The list? The porch and the window." He looked toward the kitchen. "I started the garden fence and then stopped. Felt like I was crossing things off without her, and that seemed." He stopped. "Wrong," Maren said. "Wrong," he agreed quietly. She didn't push further. She just sat with it, the way you sat with a fire that was doing what it was supposed to do. Not trying to make it larger, just being near it. After a while, Alistair picked up his book again and actually read it this time. November arrived with a cold that had intent behind it, the kind that made the air feel purposeful. The cattle needed more attention. The water troughs needed breaking twice a day, and the firewood consumption became something Maren tracked like a budget. Alistair and Connell brought in load after load, and she stacked it under the lean-to with a precision that made Connell watch her with a new expression. Not suspicion exactly, but recalibration. "You know how to stack wood," he said. It was the longest sentence he'd offered her so far. "My father was a great believer in it," she said. "He had a particular system." "What system?" She showed him. He watched, then started doing it the same way without being asked. After that, Connell talked. Not constantly, and not easily, but with the deliberate quality of someone who'd decided that something was worth the risk. He told her about the horses, which ones were his, which ones he'd named against his father's advice, which one had thrown him twice, and which he was determined to get right. He told her about a friend at school named Oliver who'd moved away in September. He told her once that he remembered his mother's voice but not her face clearly, and that this bothered him. "That happens," Maren said. "It doesn't mean you loved her less." "How do you know?" "Because I can't remember the exact sound of my husband's laugh anymore. But I remember how it made me feel. That part stays longer." Connell turned that over. "That's not as bad," he said finally. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She found the list in early December. She was reorganizing the storage room, not going through Alistair's things, just trying to find the spare lamp oil she'd been told was somewhere at the back. And she moved a wooden crate, and there it was, tucked behind. A small notebook with a brown cover, and inside handwriting that wasn't Alistair's. Rounder with loops. A woman's handwriting. Kitchen garden fence. Proper wood, not post and wire. Glass in the south window before next winter if possible. New porch boards. The second and fourth are soft. Curtains in the children's room, Petra asked. Repaint the barn door. The red is gone. Maren closed the notebook before she read further and sat very still for a moment. Then she put it back exactly where she'd found it, replaced the crate, and found the lamp oil on the second shelf. That evening she asked Alistair, over supper and in front of the children, whether he had plans to paint the barn door. He looked up, something flickered in his face. Why? He asked. The wood's going soft underneath where the paint's gone. Better to catch it now before spring wet gets in. A long pause. I know I could help. If you wanted to do it this winter inside the barn somewhere, the cold wouldn't matter. Petra looked between them. Conal just ate. I have red paint in the workshop, Alistair said. Leftover from when? He stopped. Leftover. All right, Maren said simply, and turned back to her meal. They did it on a Saturday in January, when the temperature outside would have made any other outdoor work impossible, but the barn was heated by the animals and tolerable. Alistair set up the door on sawhorses. Petra helped for 45 minutes, before getting bored and going back to the house. Conal worked steadily, without needing direction. Alistair handed Maren a brush, and they painted in silence for a while, the red going on thick and even over the weathered wood. You found the notebook, he said, not accusatory, just knowing. Maren kept her brush moving. I wasn't looking for it. I know. He dipped his brush. She made that list the first autumn we were here. Said it was everything she needed to make it feel real. He paused. I finished the porch, the window. Couldn't do the rest. You did the rest, Maren said. You just need to let yourself know that. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, how? Cross them off, she said. Get the notebook. Cross off what's done. You don't have to add to it if you don't want to. Just let her see, even if it's just in your own head, that you kept going. The silence stretched long enough that she thought she'd overstepped, but then he said quietly, The barn door's still on the list. Not after today. He didn't answer, but she noticed, when they finished and he carried the door back to rehang it, that he stood and looked at it for a moment longer than was necessary. February was the hardest month. Not the coldest. January had been colder, but hardest in the particular way of things that had been difficult for too long. Everyone's tempers ran short. Petra cried twice over things that weren't really about what she said they were about. Conal had a fight at school with a boy he wouldn't name, and came home with a split lip and a silence that lasted 4 days. Maren managed the children with the same directness she brought to everything. She didn't pretend problems weren't happening, and she didn't talk around them. When Petra cried, she sat with her until it was finished and then said, better? And when Petra said no, she said, I know. Give it a little longer. With Conal, she waited. On the second day, she put a plate of biscuits on the table at the time he usually came in from chores and said nothing. He sat down and ate. On the fourth day, unprompted, he said my mother left us. Maren set down what she was doing. The boy you fought with? He said she must have not wanted to stay. Because why else? Because people get sick, Maren said. And sometimes sick people die no matter how much they want to stay. I know that, then you know he was wrong. Conal turned his fork over on the table, end to end. I know, He stopped. It still hurt to hear. Yeah, it would hurt anyone. She pushed the biscuits closer to him. That's not weakness. That's just being a person who loved someone. He looked up at her with something that had moved past recalibration into something simpler. Did you fight people? After your husband? I wanted to, she said. I argued with the doctor who told me there was nothing more to be done. I didn't hit anyone, but I thought about it. He almost smiled. I thought you'd say something else, like, I don't know, something polite. Grief isn't polite, she said. It's just grief. Alistair heard this conversation. She knew he had. The kitchen carried sound, and he'd been in the sitting room with the door open. He didn't acknowledge it that evening. But the next morning he got up earlier than usual and made coffee, and when she came in he had a cup already poured and set at her place. It was the clearest thing he'd said to her in 4 months. The 3-month mark arrived on a Thursday. Maren had stopped tracking it consciously, but the date was in her head the way practical things were, not obsessively, just present. Alistair knocked on the frame of her open bedroom door that evening. She was writing a letter to Harriet. I need to ask you something, he said. All right. She set the pen down. He stood with his hands in his pockets, and for a moment she saw the same thing she'd seen in Conal, the weighing of whether something was worth the risk of saying. The 3 months is done, he said. I know. Do you want to go? She looked at him carefully. The question wasn't the only question. She'd lived in proximity to a closed-mouthed person long enough to hear the rest of it underneath. Is that what you want? She asked. For me to go? No. Flat and immediate, which was more honest than he'd meant to be, she thought, because something shifted in his face after it came out. I mean, the children, Alistair. He stopped. I'm not asking about the children, she said. I know what the children want. I'm asking you. The silence this time was different from his other silences, more exposed. I stopped dreading coming in for meals, he said finally. I stopped feeling like the house was a problem to be managed. He looked at the floor and then at her directly. That's not nothing. For me, it's a great deal, actually. Maren considered what to do with that honesty. She knew what she felt, had known it for some weeks, in the way you knew a winter was going to be long before it arrived, something that had quietly settled, with the particular weight of things that were real. I'd like to stay, she said. Not because I don't have elsewhere to go. I have my sister. I have options. She met his eyes. I want to stay. There's a difference. He nodded, not theatrical about it, just a nod. All right, he said. Then he said, with the air of someone offering something significant in the most practical terms available. The kitchen garden fence. If we start building it in March when the ground allows, we'll have it done before planting. Maren looked at him. Really looked. The gray at his temples, the calluses on his hands from gripping the post of the door frame. The way his expression was as careful and as sincere as anything she'd seen. Yes, she said. We can do that. Spring arrived the way it did in Alberta, reluctant at first, then all at once, mud and meltwater, and the sound of geese. They built the garden fence in the third week of March, Alistair and Conal doing the posts, while Maren and Petra measured the wire. Petra was precise about the measuring, which her father noticed and said so. She walked away from the comment glowing. They planted in May, carrots, onions, potatoes, a row of beans Maren had brought from Hamilton in a paper packet she'd saved from the previous summer. She planted them on a Tuesday, which she found fitting, proof that Tuesdays were capable of going differently than she'd assumed. One evening in June, she stood on the new porch. Alistair had replaced the boards that past winter without mentioning it, watching the light go long across the pasture. She heard the screen door and then his footsteps. Penny, he said, which was the closest he got to asking what she was thinking. I'm thinking about the first time I came up this road, she said. I thought the poplars looked lonesome. They were planted the first year we were here. My wife planted them. He came to stand beside her, not close but near enough. She said she wanted something that would look like it had always been there. It worked, Maren said. He was quiet for a moment, then she would have liked you. Maren looked at him sideways. That was possibly the most he'd ever said. How do you know? Because you're not afraid of her, he said simply. Most people get careful around someone else's grief. You just include it, like it's part of the property. She thought about that for a moment. It is, she said. The grief belongs here same as the fence does. You built both. Why would I pretend otherwise? He turned to look at her then, that sideways assessment she'd come to know well. Maren, he said, and then he stopped, because he was not a man who reached for words when they didn't come, and the thing he was trying to say didn't have a clean shape yet. I know, she said quietly. You don't know what I was going to say. I know enough. Another silence. But she'd learned the difference between his silences by now. The closed ones and the open ones. And this one was open. He started and stopped. Try it again. I think we've been something these past months. That I'd like to be more of. More official, she asked, because sometimes the practical shape of a thing helped him get there. More honest, he said, about what it is. She turned to face him properly. Then be honest, she said. I can take it. He looked at her with an expression she had no category for yet, not quite the way he looked at problems, not quite the way he looked at the children. Something that was for her alone. I love you, he said, plain and final as a fence post. I didn't expect to. I wasn't looking for it. But I've watched you sit with my son's grief and my daughter's needs, and this land's particular cruelties, and you haven't once looked for an exit, that means. He paused. It means everything, actually. Maren's throat tightened in a way she'd learned not to fight against, because fighting it only made it worse. I came here with $43 and nowhere better to go, she said. And somewhere between the burned stew and the barn door and the notebook I wasn't supposed to find, I stopped thinking of this as better than nothing. She reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on the porch rail. I think of it as mine. I haven't felt that in a long time. He turned his hand over and held hers, the way people did when they were done being careful. They married in September quietly, in the parlor with the fireplace that drew badly. They'd fix it that winter, with Conal standing straight in his good shirt, and Petra crying with the complete emotional openness of a 9-year-old who'd decided this was a crying occasion and was committing to it entirely. Maren wore her second-best dress because her best was packed away from Bernard's funeral, and she wasn't bringing it out for this, which was a different thing entirely. The minister was brief. Alistair held her hand through the vows with the same steadiness he brought to everything, and when it was done he said, very quietly, "Thank you," which was not the thing people usually said, but it was the right thing for him, and she'd stopped expecting him to say what other people said. "Thank you," she said back. Because it was her right thing too. That winter was hard in the way Alberta winters were. long and cold and asking something of everyone. But they had enough firewood, enough hay, enough preserved food from the garden Maren had planted in May. Conal turned 12 and began treating the horses with the quiet authority of someone who'd decided who he was. Petra learned to read music from a manual order-form catalog she'd sent away for with her own saved money, and taught herself 3 songs on a second-hand harmonica Alistair found in Cold Hollow. The parlor fireplace was fixed in February. In the spring, Maren added to the notebook. She found it on the shelf where Alistair had moved it. Not hidden anymore, just shelved. And she opened to the back page and wrote in her own hand. Parlor fireplace, repaired. Barn door, repainted, red. Kitchen garden fence, built. Curtains in the children's room, still needed. She left it on the kitchen table. When she came in from the garden that evening, it was gone, and she didn't ask where. 2 weeks later, there were curtains in the children's room. Blue cotton from the general store in Cold Hollow. Not fancy. Just there, doing what curtains do. Keeping out the cold, letting in the light. Maren stood in the doorway of Petra's room and looked at them for a long moment. Then she went to find Alistair and told him they were exactly right. He looked pleased in the careful way of a man who'd learned to let himself be pleased. I asked Petra what color, he said. She said blue. She said blue was her mother's favorite and also hers. Maren thought about that. About how that was not a sad thing, actually. About how a color could carry someone forward instead of just backward if you let it. That's exactly right, she said again, and meant it twice. The years that came were what years on a working ranch are, sometimes hard in ways you hadn't planned for, sometimes generous in ways you hadn't expected, always honest. The summer Conal was 16, he rode with the neighboring outfit during Roundup and came back standing straighter. The winter Petra was 12. They spent 3 weeks snowed in, with nothing but a crate of books from the lending library in each other, and came out of it closer for it. There were bad years. A summer of drought that cost them more cattle than they could afford. A September when Alistair's older brother came from Ontario and died there 4 months later, and left a silence in the house that took time to move through. And good years, better seasons, calves all surviving, the satisfaction of looking at fences that held. Maren built a life the way she'd learned to stack wood. Methodically, with attention to which pieces would bear weight. She kept the books. She kept the household. She kept the space in the house where grief was allowed to exist alongside everything else, because she'd found that was the only way to live with it without being crushed. Alistair did not become an easy man, because that was not who he was. But she'd stopped wanting easy, somewhere around the time the poplars went gold for the second autumn she'd seen them. She wanted real. He was real in every particular. On an evening in their 8th year, Maren was sitting on the porch, with the light going low across the pasture. And Alistair came out and sat beside her. And they watched a pair of hawks, working the thermals above the tree line without saying anything at all for a good long while. "What are you thinking?" he finally asked. He'd adopted the question from her, without either of them noting the moment it happened. "About the letter," she said, "the one that told me the other arrangement had fallen through." He glanced at her sideways. "The worst news I ever got," she said. "And it brought me here." He was quiet for a moment. "Does that make it not bad, retroactively?" "No," she said. "It was still bad. It still cost me things." She leaned her shoulder against his. "But the thing about bad news is it doesn't know what it's the beginning of." The hawks wheeled once more and then were gone, and the light continued doing what prairie light did, stretching, golden, refusing to give up until the very last possible moment. "No," Alistair said. "I suppose it doesn't." He put his arm around her, and she let the evening be what it was. Not a conclusion, not a proof, but a thing that had grown from what had been planted. That was enough, more than enough. It was hers.